All right. Good morning. Thanks, Virginia. Thanks everybody for having me on the panel this morning. I'm happy to talk about this. I'm happy to be here. I think some folks had submitted some questions that we'll definitely get to. And let me just kind of start with some background information. I remember it was last December, in December 2020, and the U.S. had just started rolling out the vaccines. We had about 40 million doses that they were going to distribute to healthcare workers, frontline workers, folks in nursing homes and whatnot. And I remember hearing at the time that some of those healthcare providers, the companies, were going to start making the vaccines mandatory for their employees. And I thought to myself, well, this is going to be interesting because it's not uncommon for hospital systems and big medical companies to mandate vaccines. For example, for years, a lot of healthcare companies have mandated flu shot, or they'll tell their employees, if you don't have a flu shot, you have to wear masks during the high flu season. So I wasn't surprised to hear they were going to make this mandatory for their healthcare workers. But then I got to thinking, what's going to happen in the spring and summer when more and more companies start making this mandatory? This is going to be a huge issue. And as you saw, I think in winter and spring and early summer, you started hearing about companies try and get into this issue as far as making it mandatory. I think a lot of things played against that. For example, the labor shortage, I think, made it difficult for a lot of big companies to mandate the vaccine because they were concerned that those workers who did not want the vaccine would just leave and go somewhere else. But there are two events that happened within the past 30 days or so that I think really kind of put this whole issue in the forefront. The first event was last month when the FDA gave the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine the full accreditation. Previously it was only emergency use authorization, so they gave it the full accreditation, which I think made it easier for employers to start mandating now that the vaccine has been fully approved by the FDA. And then a couple of weeks ago, you might have seen where President Biden came out. He had a big pronouncement, and he basically said that all federal government employees and contractors are going to have to get vaccinated, and he made no exception for workers that were testing negative. A lot of companies are saying, hey, you have to get vaccinated, but if you show up every couple of days with a negative test, then we'll let it slide. But Biden's his requirement is you must get vaccinated. So I think those two events, again, the Biden's pronouncement and then the Pfizer BioNTech full FDA authorization, has really kind of cleared the way for a lot of companies to start mandating, which brings about a whole host of legal issues. So where we'll start with this is if you want to make a policy, if you want to make a vaccination policy mandatory in your company, you have to create a new rule. You have to create a new policy. However your company creates rules, you have to go through that standard process. Some companies, it's very simple. Other companies have a very protracted process for putting new rules into place. Whatever that policy is, whatever that procedure is, that needs to be followed for this. You also have to be mindful if you are in a business that is subject to, if you have union members and you've got any type of collective bargaining or anything like that, you need to work through all those issues as well. Also, if you have employees that are on contracts, have an employment contract, you need to check those contracts to make sure that you can enact a policy that would basically override what's in that contract. So aside from that, that's the general steps you have to take it into consideration before you make a policy. Now, people ask, well, what happens if I have a policy and somebody refuses to comply? Somebody refuses to get vaccinated. What do you do? Can you put them in? Can there be disciplinary action for that violation? The answer is yes, there can be. A lot of companies are having a progressive disciplinary action where they will start with a verbal warning, then a written warning, and then it'll progress up to possibly termination, just like any other violation. So however you want to structure it, you can. But there are some caveats because the vaccination requirement is different from an average policy in the workplace that, for example, requires employees to show up on time. Because the vaccination policy, there's two different laws that go into play as far as requiring the vaccine. The first one, and they're both federal laws, so they're going to apply across the board to all employers and employees throughout the country. The first law is the EEOC, and the second one is the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. So let's start with the EEOC. The EEOC says that you can't make any type of policy, including mandating vaccines, to where it's discriminatory. So, for example, you could not tell specific segments of your workforce who are maybe based on sex, age, national origin, or race. You cannot tell them they have to be vaccinated and not others. I think that sounds fairly obvious these days, right? But over and above that, you can't have a policy that has a disparate impact. And what that means in English is we all know you can't openly discriminate against somebody for race, race, national origin, sexual orientation, etc. But let's say you have a company that has multiple locations across the country. If certain locations have a higher population of a protected class than other locations, you can't mandate those locations to be vaccinated and not others. So that would definitely, if you did that, that could be a violation of the EEOC. If there are violations of the EEOC, then there are the EEOC can investigate you. There could be civil penalties. There could also be litigation where they can sue you in court for damages. And so far, we've already started seeing this, where we've got EEOC complaints against companies who are not, who basically have a discriminatory or allegedly discriminatory vaccine policy. The other issue you need to be concerned with is the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, the ADA says that you can't discriminate in giving vaccines to somebody because they have some type of disability. And and so, for example, if you say, well, we're going to have this policy to mandate vaccination, an employee comes to you and says they have a valid health concern, then you have accommodation for that employee. So, for example, if an employee says, look, I cannot get the vaccine because my doctor says that I'm at risk for something. And if that's the case, you cannot take disciplinary action against that employee. You can't fire that employee. You need to make a reasonable accommodation. And that reasonable accommodation really depends on the extent of their disability. It depends on the type of company you have. But for example, we've had some employers come to us recently and with this issue, and they simply let that person work remote instead of coming into the office. Now, a lot of you might be rolling your eyes about that, but that's one type of accommodation that you can make. One other thing, I left one thing off on the EEOC side. In addition to discrimination, if an employee has a closely held belief that the vaccine is wrong, then they can use that as a reason to not have to follow the policy of getting vaccinated. So, for example, if the employee has a religious belief against taking medication, or if they have a closely held personal belief that they hold inviolate, that they hold very, very close to them, they could use that as a reason not to get the vaccine. So, in other words, you don't have to necessarily belong to a certain church or follow a certain religion or worship a certain God in order to say that your religious beliefs prohibit you from getting the vaccine. We say that you don't have to get it because you have a closely held belief that says that you don't want to get it. Now that's a tough call to work around, because if somebody comes to you and says that, you have to be very careful, because if you challenge that person too much, they could claim that you're being discriminatory against their religious beliefs. So that is the nutshell version of how all this works. But I'm sure there's probably a whole host of questions. So I'm going to stop right now and see if there are any questions that have come from that. Regina, I don't know if you've seen any.
I don't at the moment, but I actually have a question. So Could you just clarify just a little bit on the EOC law? I heard as long as the company is pushing it across the board, no, they're not requiring it in certain places versus others. It's not illegal to require vaccines unless they have a religious exemption. Is that what I'm understanding?
That is exactly correct. Yeah. As long as the company is saying, look, across the board, all employees have to get it. If somebody pipes up with a disability or some type of closely held religious belief, that would give them an excuse. But from the company's standpoint, you could, as long as it's uniform across the workforce, then you're in much better shape. You can do it.
Okay, perfect. And then we did have a question come in. It is from Janet. Thank you. Will there be guidelines for vetting the closely held belief exemption?
Yeah, there actually are guidelines. I don't know if there will be specifically for COVID, but that's not a new law. And so there's plenty of case law and there's plenty of precedent about what that really means. And so I'm sure as time goes by, there'll be precedent established as it comes with specifically for vaccines. But if you look at other issues in the past where people have used that as a reason for as a discrimination, it's something that they have to show that they have like a pattern of this belief, and they have to establish that it's not something they just kind of made up. I'm not trying to be flippant about that, but it's something that they have to show that's like a consistent belief that they have, and they have to be able to show that some evidence, reasonable evidence, that it's been it's something that they actually like practice throughout their life. It's not a very intrusive investigation. You can't really intrude into the employee's private life, but they have to be able to show that this is a belief they have. They have to give some examples of how they carry out this belief throughout their life. That's a very generic way of stating it, but yeah, at some point there will be more and more, as these issues come up more and more often, there'll be a lot more precedent as far as what flies. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I hear a defense all the time where, they're not sure what's in it. So they're a little worried about how it will affect them. It's not necessarily religious belief. They don't trust the vaccine. But in the past, they've been happy to get flu vaccines and everything else. So in that instance, for instance, my company tracks whether or not we get the flu vaccine. And if someone got the flu vaccine and then suddenly they're against the coronavirus vaccine, right, they basically don't have a defense.
Yeah, well, and that's a lot of, so if you're going to make the argument that you don't know what's in it and therefore you're afraid of it, you're going to have to make a connection between that and some type of disability, most likely. So you're going to have to say that there's some physical condition that you have that prevents you from taking it or puts you at a higher risk for a health concern if you do take it. Merely stating that you don't know what's in it it's not gonna fly. That's just you're not gonna have a claim for discrimination just by saying I don't know what's in the vaccine. And if your employer wants to take disciplinary action and that's your only excuse, then be able to take that disciplinary action.
Okay, perfect. I believe that addresses Jim Peck's question, confirming that it can't just be a personal opinion. It has to be a belief. But you're saying as long as they can prove a pattern that it's a personal belief, not necessarily affiliated with the religious church,
yeah,
then it's still an exemption.
Yeah. But like I said, you have to really, you have to show that like you can't just come up with a personal belief that I believe this is wrong. You have to have some personal belief about some way that how you live your life. It has to go beyond just the vaccine. It has to be something that you demonstrate that you've done in the past, or that a personal belief that affects you in more ways than just saying no to the vaccine. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. And then we have a question from Mary Stocks. If the individual were to have side effects as a result of the shots, is the company liable?
Yeah, it's a good question. No, the company's not going to be liable for that. In fact, the company is not even supposed to be be tracking side effects. Not to get too deep in the weeds for that, but the company is not liable for you going out and get the vaccine because they don't. First of all, there's a causal issue there. I mean, how do we know that you got sick from the vaccine, for example? That's a big question. But the short answer to that question is no. There's not going to be liability if you get the vaccine and you have some type of side effect. Now, that does raise another question where, and we had this come up a lot back in the spring when more and more people were getting vaccinated, where they would have side effects that would affect them for a couple of days, and they wanted to take time off, and the employer was thinking, well, let's see, we mandated this, and now the employee's sick. Do we give them additional paid time off so they can recover from these side effects? And you're not legally required to do that, but we did have a lot of companies that gave employees additional time off to recover. Some of them required a doctor's note. Some just did it on the honor system. But that is another issue that might come up as far as side effects go.
Okay, and a question came in yesterday. They were asking if employers are allowed to require you to show proof of vaccination. Like if they request your vaccination card to prove it, are they allowed to do that, or is that illegal or a violation of HIPAA? Yeah,
it's good. These are all great questions. You can request the proof of the vaccine, the vaccine passport. There's nothing illegal about that. As far as the privacy concerns, once an employee gives you any type of doctor's note, whether it's for the vaccine or anything, they go to the doctor because they're not feeling well, and you say bring in a doctor's note. Any type of medical information from an employee is subject to the ADA secrecy privacy laws, and so it's not necessarily HIPAA, but it's the ADA privacy laws, which are very similar to HIPAA, and so in the ADA really pretty specific about this. So your medical records that you give your employer have to be kept secret. They even have to be kept in a separate file, separate and apart from your employee file, to help from inadvertent disclosure of your medical records. The employers are required to keep those medical records confidential and keep them on file for a minimum of a year or 2 years after the employee leaves. If the employee leaves within that 1 year period, you have to keep it for 2 years. But yes, if you breach that ADA privacy law, you could be held liable for penalties under the ADA, depending on the type of company that you have. Of larger company, you could be held liable up to $300,000 per violation. Also, keep in mind every state has data breach laws, and so if you violate, you could also be subject to state data breach laws and state data breach reporting if you let that information out. So you got to be really careful about how you store those records. But frankly, if you have a well-run HR department and they're used to storing medical records because they do it for all their other employees, the vaccine records are handled no differently.
Okay, and so to add to that question, if the employer is requiring proof and the employee, even if they've gotten the vaccine, does not want to provide that proof, does the employee have any defense whatsoever?
No, it's going to be hard to do that. I mean, if there are some companies are saying the vaccine is on the honor system, but for those companies who are requiring proof of the vaccine, as long as they follow about this morning, if you fail to show that you actually had the shot or shots, then it's very difficult for you to not be subject to whatever disciplinary action your employer has.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we have another question from Sally Shopmeyer. Her question is, employers with over 100 employees are also responsible for mandating vaccines. If a company fails to comply, how is OSHA going to fine offenders?
It's a good question. So you have a duty as a company to under OSHA to provide a safe workplace. And so if you remember back in the olden days of the virus, we had this discussion because the issue was about social distancing and wearing masks and whatnot. And OSHA had, there are all a whole set of rules as far as OSHA, what OSHA said about how you have to have your workplace in order to provide a safe environment for workers. Well, it's kind of this that really hasn't changed a whole lot. You still have to provide a safe environment for your workers, and if you're going to requiring vaccines is a good way to provide that safe environment. So, but if OSHA, if you're not providing a safe environment for your employees because of COVID, typically what would happen is somebody would blow the whistle, would call OSHA. OSHA would come out and they would inspect, and they would look at what you're doing holistically throughout your company as far as what your COVID response. And so if that's not going, so if OSHA believes that holistically you're not doing a good enough job to make a safe workplace, then there could be fines involved. This you may recall there were incidents. It's very some Amazon, for example. There were some. They had some bad publicity back in the early days of the virus about a lot of the factory workers, or not factory, the warehouse workers who were just crammed close together. No one was wearing masks, no PPP or PPE, nothing, right? And so there are all types of OSHA claims for them, and they I think they finally got it figured out, but it was obviously a very, very bad look for Amazon, and I believe there actually were some fines handed out from OSHA. So OSHA would look at the vaccine treatment in largely the same way. I hope that makes sense to you.
I think it does. Sally, does that answer your question? She said yes. Okay, perfect. Let me jump back really quick because there's a question I missed. I think you may have asked it or answered it, excuse me, but it's legal for a company or a university to basically reject a religious exemption request, correct?
Is it legal for them to reject?
Yes. Is it? Yeah, is it legal?
If it's only if it's an invalid request. I mean, if it's a valid request, they have to accept it. Now, you don't have to accept it at face value. You can inquire about it and ask the employee to give you some basis for why they're using that as an exception. But you can't just outright ignore it. But if somebody's let's play this out. Let's say you have a policy that says, hey, we want all employees to get the vaccine, and an employee comes up to you and says, I have a religious belief, I'm not going to get it. You're within your right as the employer to ask them to give you further information about that religious belief and why it prohibits them from getting the vaccine. And so the employee then puts the burden back on them to give a reasonable explanation as to what religious belief they have that prohibits them from getting the vaccine. Now, I will tell you, if that happens to you, you got to be really careful because you don't want to step into a situation where you're discriminating against somebody. And so if that does happen, if that situation happens, you really need to call an HR professional who's used to handling these situations, or call a lawyer that's used to handling these situations. And anytime you're getting into a back and forth discussion with your employees about their religious beliefs, this hot button topic, you really need to proceed with caution, because there are a lot of missteps that you can get. It's not a good DIY project if you haven't done it before. So have these conversations with your employees. You legally can, but you must proceed with caution, because you could really, I'm trying to be politically correct here, you really step into this, and you know what, if you don't properly ask the proper questions or ask them in the proper way.
Okay. Christy Vasilou asked that question. Christy, did you have any additional questions about that, or does that answer your question? She said that helps. Wonderful. Okay, and we have one other question. This comes from Mary Stocks. She mentioned that, this is already being pursued in the courts and likely will be expedited all the way to the Supreme Court. How can we be certain this will be determined constitutional versus unconstitutional?
It's a great question. We don't know. We really don't know. As we sit here today, we don't know how it's gonna shake out. It could very well be. It could go either way. It could come out as being an unconstitutional act. And if that's the case, it's gonna turn the whole world, the whole vaccine world on its ear. I would suspect, and this is not legal advice, this is just pure conjecture. I would suspect the Supreme Court is going to find a way to make it constitutional, and given the composition of the Supreme Court right now, that may be difficult. But I just have I think that politically they would have a hard time making it unconstitutional. That's not legal advice. I should have said it. That's probably opinion. That's definitely opinion. But my point is that usually in situations like this, the Supreme Court tries to find a way to make things work. Let's put it that way. And that's probably where this thing would land. But you never know. You never know.
And if for some reason they find it unconstitutional, what sort of repercussions do you think companies have to deal with? Will they have to go and basically, will it be retroactive and they have to go and right the wrongs?
You're gonna, if they find it unconstitutional, the companies, it's going to be, it could be a nightmare for companies, because if it's unconstitutional from day one. It's not. So if the Supreme Court comes out tomorrow or 6 months from now and says mandatory vaccines are unconstitutional, that means it was unconstitutional since day one, and not just from the day they make the decision. So you would have to go back as an employer. You'd have to go back to the date you first had your policy in place, and anything that you would have done to an employee, like discipline or firing or whatever, you're now subject to a claim because that was an unconstitutional act.
Okay.
Does that make sense? So that could be very, very, that could be a nightmare for employers. And that's why I was hinting that I think the Supreme Court's going to find a way to make it constitutional, just because it would turn this whole thing on its ear.
Okay. And so I don't know if you had something prepared on masks or not. If you don't, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead. Mask away. Yeah.
So, do you think, or are masks considered completely different because it falls more under a uniform category versus like a vaccine where it's more medical related? Yeah.
Now there are some. Yes, it does, but there are some physical conditions that make wearing masks complicated. Some people with breathing asthma or some type of respiratory issues have a hard time wearing masks, and so you could still have situations where if you mandate mask wearing, there could be a discrimination claim if you have a disability, i.e., like asthma or something that prohibits you from wearing it. And so it's you can treat it as a uniform, but it's still someone could still argue that they've got a physical impairment that prohibits it. And then if that's the case, since that would be an ADA issue, you have to make a reasonable accommodation for that person. Now, back in the early days of the pandy, in the early days of the Rona, what we were seeing for those people that had those physical limitations and could not wear masks, they would either work from home or the company would have social distancing for everybody, so they'd be far enough apart where it would really kind of negate the need for the mask. So that same thing would apply still today, if that makes sense.
That does. I'm going to open it up one last time. Does anyone else have additional questions about the vaccine or masks or anything else that you have dealt with during the pandemic? It looks like we don't have any more questions. Tony, did you have any closing remarks for us?
No, I would be kind of curious. I don't know how we can find this out. How many folks out there, if their employers have mandated the vaccine or not. I'm just pure curiosity.
If your company has mandated the vaccine, would you mind pressing your little hand up button and leave it up for a little bit so that we can get a count?
Wow.
I raised my hand.
That's interesting. I was really just curious to see what how many people, but that's.
It looks like I only see 4 hands at the moment.
Yeah.
But I know at least one other person on there, their company is requiring it. Yeah. So thank you. You guys can lower your hands or virtual hands now. Well, thank you so much, Tony.
Thank you, Virginia. Yeah, you guys are great.
Insights. Yeah, thank you for sharing your insights. I mean, COVID-19 has certainly complicated our lives and forced us to make tough decisions. So thank you for your guidance and always being available for us when we need you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, oh, and Tony, please get better.
Yeah, thanks. I hope so.
This won't be the last you hear from Tony. He will be our featured speaker at the next BOMA Greater Dallas member luncheon on Tuesday, October 19th at Prestonwood Country Club. Stay tuned for more details. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.